On a summer Saturday afternoon, the hospital campus was bathed in the warm glow of sunlight, with verdant greenery providing a serene backdrop. At the fountain surrounded by inviting benches, families and friends awaited their reunions. Among them, under the shade of a lime tree, sat Rodrigo, a young man in his 30s, immersed in his tablet. Despite the tranquil setting, Rodrigo's presence was marked by a deeper story. Rodrigo, the director of a prominent IT company, was not here by mere chance. Since childhood, he had carried the weight of a hereditary heart condition, a shadow cast by his family's past. Years earlier, a fateful conversation revealed the bleak future that awaited him. The echoes of his mother's sorrowful words lingered long after her untimely death, drowned by a river's rage. Now, Rodrigo faced the reality he had long anticipated, surrounded by memories of loss and a legacy of hardship. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was an enduring hope and a quiet strength that shone through. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. On a breathtakingly beautiful summer Saturday afternoon, the hospital grounds were bathed in a warm, inviting embrace of sunlight, and the vibrant greenery around them seemed to glow with life. The fountain, encircled by a ring of cozy benches, served as a serene sanctuary where visitors, their faces alight with anticipation and hope, waited patiently to be reunited with their beloved family members. A charming, narrow alley, alive with the symphony of chirping birds and the soothing murmur of gently swaying leaves, meandered its way toward the hospital gates. Beneath the sprawling canopy of a grand lime tree, a young man sat, absorbed in the screen of his tablet, his posture conveying an impression of earnest diligence despite his status as a patient. In truth, Rodrigo was indeed deeply engrossed in his tasks, though his efforts were overshadowed by the emotional weight of his situation. Rodrigo, now in his early 30s, had risen to the position of director at a prestigious IT company, a testament to his intellect and determination. Yet, here he found himself in the cardiology department of the hospital, not by mere chance but by the inexorable twist of fate he had dreaded for years. The shadow of his impending condition had loomed over him since his childhood, casting a long and dark pall over his life. He vividly recalled an unsettling moment from his school days when he had inadvertently overheard a deeply distressing conversation between his mother, Maria, and a close friend. Maria's voice had been heavy with despair as she mournfully spoke. "Oh, my poor boy, he is destined to suffer from the same hereditary affliction that plagued his father." Her friend, clearly weighed down by her sorrow, had replied with a sigh that spoke of deep anguish. "Rebecca, your husband recently succumbed to a heart condition." With tears glistening in her eyes, Rebecca responded, "Yes, it's a cruel inheritance from his family. I can only hope he never has to watch the light of his child flicker and fade." Tragically, Rebecca herself had never lived to witness such a heartbreaking scenario. She had met her end 5 years prior, claimed by a ruthless and unforgiving river. On that somber night, Maria had called Rodrigo with the crushing news. "Rodrigo, Rebecca is no longer with us. The funeral will be held in 3 days." The gravity of the news left him stunned, his voice barely a whisper as he responded, "It can't be true." Amid his disbelief and shock, his compassionate colleagues from the small, tight-knit company where he worked had banded together, pooling their resources to provide him with a plane ticket for the somber journey. The stark reality of his mother's death hit him with full force only when he stood before her coffin. It felt as though the very ground had been yanked away from beneath his feet, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief. It was during this profound period of vulnerability that Raquel, a colleague who had worked closely with his mother, stepped in to offer her support. Her intelligence and warmth immediately resonated with Rodrigo, and the connection they formed was further strengthened by the shared sorrow and circumstances they faced. As Raquel observed Rodrigo's demeanor, she couldn't help but be struck by his composed and kind nature. She found his calmness and financial stability appealing, and the prospect of being with someone so emotionally resilient and well-established was immensely comforting. In her view, it felt akin to marrying a wealthy orphan, a notion that seemed almost idyllic amidst the complexities of life. Rodrigo was not just an adept IT professional. He was a prodigy whose brilliance attracted equally gifted enthusiasts who shared his passion for transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. His leadership and visionary spirit soon bore fruit when his team achieved a remarkable victory at an international programming competition. The accolade was more than just a triumph. It was a gateway to boundless opportunities. As the company's CEO warmly shook Rodrigo's hand, he praised, "Congratulations, young man. With our multimillion-dollar grant, the world is your oyster. Your innovative ideas can now become a tangible reality." Rodrigo's heart swelled with pride and gratitude as he responded, "Thank you. I've always believed that dreams can come true, and now I know it with certainty." However, the journey to success did not shield Rodrigo from the complexities of life. Just a year later, Raquel, basking in the glow of her forthcoming marriage to Rodrigo, flaunted her newfound opulence. Dressed in an exquisite wedding gown and adorned with an extravagant necklace, she eagerly shared her good fortune with a hint of vindictive satisfaction. "Just wait until Estella sees this," Raquel confided to her friend, reveling in her lavish lifestyle. "I'll invite her to witness the splendid life I'm about to enjoy with a wealthy husband." Despite the grandeur of the celebration, the festivity was marred by an underlying sense of emptiness and pretense. Rodrigo's colleagues, who had been invited to the wedding, found themselves repelled by the bride's arrogance and aloof demeanor. Their initial admiration for Rodrigo's choice quickly dissipated. Hernan, Rodrigo's loyal assistant, expressed his dismay, stating, "Look at her. She's so full of herself. Rodrigo is known for his humility and respect, but Raquel seems like a facade. Mark my words, he'll come to regret this." Dona Inés, the wise and discerning secretary, echoed his concerns with grave sincerity. "She's ill-mannered and uncultured. It's clear that individuals like her cling to their prey and drain them dry." Dona Inés's forewarnings proved prophetic. Within just 2 short years, Rodrigo found himself trapped in a miserable marriage with a wife whose insatiable greed overshadowed any semblance of marital harmony. Despite their affluence, Raquel was notoriously frugal when it came to assisting Rodrigo's friends. While she extravagantly splurged on herself, lavish salons, designer outfits, and opulent parties at elite venues became her primary indulgences. Their home, once a vibrant social hub, now received dwindling visits from friends and colleagues. Rodrigo felt increasingly alienated and superfluous, his presence overshadowed by his wife's relentless pursuit of luxury. Amidst this personal turmoil, Rodrigo began to experience troubling health issues. The once unfamiliar pangs of heart trouble led him to seek urgent medical attention, thrusting him into the hospital. Raquel's visit was disappointingly infrequent and marked by her discontent. "How can this be?" she complained, her voice tinged with irritation. "Instead of tending to my sick husband, we're expected to stay here instead of going to Paris." As Rodrigo lay in his hospital bed, grappling with the reality of his deteriorating health and a marriage that had become a source of deep distress, he was confronted with a stark truth. The glittering facade of success and wealth had come at a profound personal cost. "No, I'm not pregnant," Raquel declared with resolute firmness, her lips pursed tightly. "You know perfectly well that I can't conceive. My tests are normal, and according to the doctor, the issue isn't with me. It's with you, Rodrigo. You're sterile." "I'm sorry, but that's the reality," she added with a dismissive shrug. "So, no children for us. But we could always consider adopting from an orphanage if you're open to it." Her suggestion was met with a vehement denial. "I refuse to bring home a child from a working-class background. I'd prefer to remain childless." Raquel insisted with a finality that brooked no argument. That was the end of their discussion. With a dismissive wave, she left for Paris, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement, and promptly filed for divorce. She cited Rodrigo's infertility as the reason for their separation, emotionally devastating him. The last time Rodrigo saw her was in the cold, clinical setting of the courtroom. There, Raquel made a dramatic entrance on the arm of a tall, muscular man, proudly introducing him as her new fiancé. The divorce was finalized, leaving Rodrigo to grapple with the sting of betrayal and loneliness once more. Yet, In his darkest hour, his steadfast friends and colleagues rallied around him, throwing a celebration in his honor. Congratulations on breaking free from the clutches of that duplicitous seductress with minimal collateral damage, Hernan toasted, his voice brimming with both relief and camaraderie. Here's to your newfound freedom and the adventure that lies ahead. Cheers to you, my friend. Their cheers and well wishes were heartening, but Rodrigo's relief was short-lived. After the festivities, he began to feel unwell again, prompting a swift call for an ambulance. Dr. Lorenzo, his trusted physician, met him with a concerned frown. "You need to take better care of yourself, Rodrigo," the doctor admonished gently. "I specifically advised you to avoid stress and overexertion. Have you been pushing yourself too hard at the gym, or perhaps engaging in some extreme activities like skydiving?" "I just went through a divorce," Rodrigo replied with a weary sigh, "and it's been incredibly taxing." Dr. Lorenzo placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, his expression sympathetic but serious. "I'm afraid you'll need to stay here for observation," the doctor said, his brow furrowing in concern. "I'll start you on conservative treatment, but you might require surgery shortly. Your heart is functioning at the level of an 80-year-old's right now. Some of its components will need to be replaced if you want to have any hope of reaching 40. Yes, it's quite serious." Rodrigo's face reflected his mounting anxiety as he asked, "Is it dangerous?" Dr. Lorenzo's gaze was grave but steady as he replied, "It certainly is concerning. We need to address this urgently to prevent further complications. But we'll do everything we can to get you through this." "Well, it's no more dangerous than continuing to live with such a worn-out heart, young man," Dr. Lorenzo said, his voice imbued with a mixture of concern and resignation. His eyes, though sympathetic, carried the weight of the grim reality he was about to unveil. "But yes, there are considerable risks associated with the surgery. First and foremost, anesthesia itself presents a significant risk. There's no precise way to predict how your heart and brain will cope with the stress. Each person's physiology is unique, and the outcome of the surgery can be highly unpredictable. We cannot entirely rule out complications, and, unfortunately, no one can guarantee how your body will respond to them." Dr. Lorenzo continued with a clinical detachment that masked his underlying empathy. "Even with the most skilled surgeon, there is always the potential for a tremor in the hand or an accidental touch of a nerve or artery. My overall prognosis stands at 50%, which, in these circumstances, is quite hopeful. It's a coin toss, but it's not without its potential for success." Rodrigo's expression shifted to one of profound concern and confusion. "How can it be only 50%? I was expecting a more optimistic outlook, perhaps at least 80%, he implored, his voice tinged with desperation. The doctor sighed deeply, his gaze steady but marked with a hint of frustration. "I wish I could offer a more reassuring percentage, but the reality is that this situation is fraught with uncertainty. For now, I don't think proceeding with the surgery is advisable. Time is a critical factor in your case," Lorenzo added, his voice softened by a note of sorrowful understanding. "If you choose to move forward, do let me know promptly." With those final words, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality. Rodrigo was left alone on the bench under the shade of the lime tree, the gentle rustle of its leaves a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He watched as the hospital campus came to life with patients enjoying their morning walks, the scene seemingly vibrant and full of promise. The fountain, with its refreshing gurgles and sparkling water, was a symbol of life's ongoing flow, a sharp juxtaposition to Rodrigo's sense of impending stagnation. As he sat there, feeling a growing sense of weakness and dizziness, Julia, a young nurse with a nurturing demeanor, approached him. Her eyes, filled with genuine concern, scanned his pale face. "You don't look well at all," she said softly. "You've probably skipped breakfast, which could be why you're feeling so faint and drained. Come with me to the dining room. I'll ensure they prepare a table for you. You must get some nourishment." Rodrigo's response was barely more than a whisper, his fatigue making his words slow and labored. "I'm not hungry. I don't have much of an appetite," he murmured, Julia's insistence was unwavering. Regardless, you need to eat something whether you feel like it or not. It's essential for your recovery and overall well-being, she said with a firm but gentle tone. What's your name? Rodrigo asked, his curiosity piqued by her determined kindness. He looked at her with a faint smile, seeing a glimmer of warmth that reminded him of simpler, happier times. Julia, she replied, her cheeks flushing slightly with a touch of shyness. I'm almost finished with my nursing studies, Julia continued, her voice brimming with youthful enthusiasm. I took this job to gain practical experience and make a difference in patients' lives. It's been rewarding, despite the challenges. Her words, though filled with professional dedication, carried a sense of personal commitment that seemed to brighten the bleakness of Rodrigo's situation. The simple act of kindness from Julia, combined with the vivid memories of his past struggles and triumphs, made Rodrigo reflect on his life's twists and turns. He was caught in a moment of profound introspection, grappling with the uncertainty of his health and the complexities of his personal life. The juxtaposition of Julia's sincere concern against the backdrop of his desolation painted a poignant picture of resilience and fragility. That evening, with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, Rodrigo playfully introduced Cristina to his friends and colleagues as his fiancée. It was all in good fun, a light-hearted jest that caused ripples of laughter among the group. Yet, as the adage goes, there's often a grain of truth buried within every joke. What began as a teasing comment soon took on a life of its own. The chemistry between Rodrigo and Cristina was undeniable, and as days turned into nights and nights into weeks, the two found themselves naturally gravitating toward each other, their bond growing stronger with every passing moment. Before long, they decided to move in together, choosing to share their lives under the same roof. And with that decision, a new chapter in their lives began. Barely a month after they had started living together, Rodrigo, swept up in a wave of newfound happiness, proposed to Cristina. She wasn't anything like Raquel, his first wife, who had left wounds on his heart that he thought would never heal. Cristina, in stark contrast, was a beacon of love and understanding, her warmth enveloping him in a cocoon of safety and reassurance. With her, Rodrigo felt a peace that had long eluded him. His once quiet and lonely home was now filled with the sound of laughter and joy. His friends, who had drifted away during the darker times of his life, began to return, drawn back by the magnetic warmth that Cristina brought into his world. They gathered at his home once more, the air filled with the smell of grilling meat, the sounds of clinking glasses, and the spirited chatter of barbecues and board game nights that stretched into the early hours. It wasn't long before Rodrigo and Cristina stood together at the altar, their vows exchanged in a ceremony that was as modest as it was intimate. It was exactly as Cristina had envisioned it, quiet, almost invisible to the outside world, a private celebration of their love. There were no grand displays, no extravagant gestures, just the simple, pure joy of two souls committing to one another. Rodrigo's colleagues, many of whom were still single and searching for love, couldn't help but envy his good fortune. "You've lucked out with her," they would say, their voices tinged with both admiration and a hint of jealousy. "How on earth did you manage to win her over?" they'd ask, half joking, half serious. Rodrigo could only laugh, a sound that was full of disbelief and happiness. "She came to me," he'd reply, still astonished by the sheer luck of it all, as if he was afraid that acknowledging his good fortune too fully might somehow cause it to slip away. But as the saying goes, even in the happiest of times, life has a way of casting unexpected shadows. Rodrigo's long-dormant illness, which had been a mere whisper in the back of his mind, reared its ugly head once more. The symptoms, which he had almost forgotten, returned with a vengeance, forcing him to confront a reality he had hoped to avoid. In his vulnerable state, he turned to Cristina, the woman who had become his anchor in the storm. With a heavy heart, he confided in her about the worsening condition of his health and the looming possibility of surgery. Cristina, ever pragmatic, listened carefully before responding with a shrug that was both casual and concerned. "You decide to make," she told him, her voice steady, though it carried the weight of her words. But remember, surgery isn't a guaranteed solution. There's no promise of a complete cure, and you have to consider the risks. What if something goes wrong? You could end up disabled or worse. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. You need to think this through carefully. Rodrigo found himself overwhelmed with doubt, his mind a battleground between fear and hope. The prospect of surgery loomed large, but so did the terrifying possibility of life afterward. What if the operation didn't go as planned? What if he came out of it worse off than before? These thoughts plagued him, gnawing at his already fragile resolve. In the end, he decided to push the thought of surgery out of his mind, vowing not to consider it unless he had no other choice, unless the illness struck him down again with even greater force. That day came far sooner than he had anticipated. It was in the dead of night when the pain surged through him, a relentless, unyielding force that gripped his chest and squeezed until he could barely breathe. The next thing he knew, he was being rushed to the hospital, sirens wailing around him as the ambulance sped through the streets. Upon arrival, Rodrigo was quickly whisked away to the cardiology unit, where he was met by Dr. Lorenzo is a seasoned physician with a calm demeanor and a steady hand. Rodrigo was on the brink of death, teetering on the edge of an abyss, but Dr. Lorenzo fought valiantly to pull him back. With years of experience behind him, Lorenzo managed to stabilize Rodrigo, bringing him back from the brink and admitting him to the intensive care unit, where he would remain for the next few days, suspended in a state between life and something much darker. During those harrowing days, Rodrigo's thoughts were a whirlpool of anxiety and gratitude. He couldn't help but think about how close he had come to losing everything. His life, his new wife, the future they were supposed to share. But he was also grateful deeply and profoundly for the second chance he had been given. He owed his life to Dr. Lorenzo and the team of doctors who had worked tirelessly to save him. And then there was Christina, the woman who had promised to stand by him through thick and thin. "Don't worry," Dr. Lorenzo had told her when she arrived at the hospital, her face a mask of concern. "He's going to be okay. Just make sure he's surrounded by love and care. That's the best medicine anyone can receive. Be gentle with him, and don't let him carry any more burdens. Life is too short for that." Christina nodded, her expression unreadable, as she promised to do just that. But as she left Dr. Lorenzo's office, her mind was already drifting elsewhere, her thoughts consumed by matters far removed from the hospital and her husband's precarious condition. Every day, Christina made her way to the hospital, her visits as routine as clockwork. Yet, no matter how often she came, she never stayed long. "I can't stay for too long, Rodrigo," she'd say as she prepared to leave, her tone more businesslike than affectionate. "There's so much to take care of at work. I have to make some important calls to the investors, and on top of that, my parents are coming from Germany soon. They're eager to meet you, and there's a lot to organize. A translator, accommodations, transportation, it's a lot of work, as you can imagine, especially being the head of such a prestigious company." She said these things almost as if to reassure herself, as if the business of her life could justify the distance she maintained. Rodrigo, lying in his hospital bed, could only offer her a weak smile in return, though deep down, he couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness. "It doesn't bother me at all," he would reassure her, his voice soft, masking the ache in his heart. "Take care of your business, work is work after all. You know, it's funny, my first wife never worked a day in her life, but my second wife, well, she's a workaholic. I guess there's no middle ground." He would laugh then, a hollow sound that echoed in the sterile room. Christina would laugh along with him, their voices blending in a way that seemed almost forced, as if they were both trying too hard to keep up the illusion of happiness. As they shared these moments, a nurse named Julia would often pass by, catching glimpses of their interaction. Julia couldn't help but admire what she saw as a picture of domestic bliss. To her, Christina and Rodrigo seemed like the perfect couple, and though she knew it wasn't right, she felt a twinge of envy. How lucky Christina was, she thought, to have a man like Rodrigo by her side. So kind, so understanding. And yet, somewhere deep within her, Julia also felt genuine happiness for Rodrigo. She had seen enough of life's hardships to appreciate the goodness in people, and Rodrigo's good heart was something that she deeply respected. The next morning, Rodrigo awoke to a strange sensation. It was as if he were being watched, the feeling so intense that it dragged him from the depths of sleep. Slowly, he opened his eyes, his vision still blurred from the remnants of a dream. When his gaze finally focused, he was startled to find two elderly strangers standing at his bedside, their presence both unexpected and unsettling. One was a man, the other a woman, both dressed in formal attire that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of the hospital. Guten Morgen. The woman's voice rang out, sharp and precise, her accent unmistakably German. She forced a smile, but it never quite reached her eyes, which shone with a cold, steely glint. Rodrigo blinked, disoriented, as he struggled to make sense of the situation. "Hello," he responded tentatively, the words slipping from his lips as he tried to gather his thoughts. It was then that he realized they had greeted him in German, a language he knew only passingly. The man stepped forward, extending his hand in a gesture that was both polite and firm. Rodrigo, though still confused, accepted the handshake, feeling the man's surprisingly strong grip as it enveloped his own. The man held his hand for longer than seemed necessary, his fingers lingering as if he were measuring something unseen. For a brief moment, Rodrigo wondered if the man was subtly taking his pulse, but he quickly dismissed the idea. The sensation, he decided, was likely just a lingering side effect of his recent ordeal, a trick of the mind brought on by fatigue and illness. As he lay there, trying to make sense of the strangers before him, Rodrigo couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that the encounter was far more significant than it appeared on the surface. But before he could dwell on it further, the couple released his hand, offering him a curt nod before turning to leave, their footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor as they disappeared. And so, Rodrigo was left alone once more, his mind swirling with thoughts of what had just transpired, of the wife who was too busy with work to stay by his side, of the doctor who had saved his life, and of the mysterious strangers who had appeared without warning. Life, it seemed, was filled with mysteries, some that could be solved, and others that would linger unanswered in the corners of his mind, haunting him in the quiet moments when he was left alone with his thoughts. The man leaned close to Christina, his voice barely above a whisper, as he conveyed a message meant for Rodrigo. Christina turned to him with a gentle smile, translating her father's words. "Mom wanted me to tell you to get well soon." Rodrigo's heart warmed at the sentiment, despite the language barrier that separated him from his in-laws. "Please thank her for her concern," he replied, attempting to infuse his words with as much sincerity as he could muster. "I don't speak German, unfortunately, but perhaps I'll try to learn it." Christina nodded and softly relayed his words to her parents. The elderly couple's faces lit up with smiles, their nods full of warmth and approval. The bride's mother then reached into her bag and pulled out a large, carefully wrapped bundle of food. With a gesture, she placed it on Rodrigo's nightstand, her actions urging him to eat it right away, as if the meal itself held the power to heal him. Rodrigo felt a profound sense of gratitude swelling within him. It was a comforting thought to have an entire family looking after his well-being. How wonderful it is to be the son-in-law of such kind-hearted people, he mused silently. His mind couldn't help but drift to Raquel's parents, whose interest in him had never gone beyond the size of his bank account. This was different. It felt real, genuine. As Christina prepared to leave with her parents, she spoke softly. "We should get going now. We need to settle them into the hotel. They've just landed from their flight and came directly here to see you." Rodrigo, wanting to reciprocate their kindness, made an earnest suggestion. "Why don't they stay at our house? We have more than enough room, and with the cook and assistant there, they wouldn't want anything. Besides," he added with a weak smile, "I'm not exactly going anywhere anytime soon." Christina chuckled softly, her smile tinged with affection. "That's very generous of you, but it's just not how we do things," she explained gently. "But I'll let them know what you said. They'll be happy to hear how thoughtful their son-in-law is." With that, she leaned down, planting a light kiss on his cheek before leaving with her parents. The next day, however, Cristina didn't visit. Rodrigo waited patiently, assuming she was tied up with work or family obligations. She sent a brief message apologizing, explaining she was incredibly busy. But when the following day came and went without any sign of her, a gnawing feeling of worry began to creep into his thoughts. Each attempt to reach her by phone went unanswered, leaving Rodrigo alone with his concerns. In contrast, Raquel's parents began visiting him daily, a presence that, while well-meaning, brought Rodrigo little comfort. Their frequent visits felt more like an obligation than a gesture of care, and though he knew he should be grateful, their company only served to remind him of the strained relationship he had once shared with their daughter. Still, Rodrigo endured their visits with polite tolerance, reminding himself that they were, after all, still his relatives. But when they finally left each day, he couldn't help but exhale a sigh of relief, the tension in his chest easing as the door closed behind them. As the days passed, Rodrigo's health began to take a turn for the worse. His heart, already weakened, now raced uncontrollably, and his overall condition deteriorated. Julia, the nurse who had become a familiar face in his room, noticed the change immediately. "Has Cristina's family left?" she asked in her usual cheerful tone, trying to lift his spirits. Rodrigo nodded, a wry smile crossing his lips. "Yes, finally," he admitted, unable to hide his relief. "Can you believe it? That foreign delegation, Cristina's parents, came to see me every single day, as if they had no other obligations. It was suffocating." Julia's expression softened, understanding the burden that had been placed on him. "Well," she said gently, "what can you do? They're Cristina's parents. Maybe that's why her relatives are always in Lorenzo's office, too. They must be really worried about you." Rodrigo nodded again, though the worry that had settled in his heart remained. Cristina's absence, the unexpected and relentless presence of her parents, and the worsening state of his health all weighed heavily on his mind, leaving him with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. "What do you mean talk? They only communicate with me through Cristina, and without her, it's like we're playing charades. They probably don't understand any complicated medical terms in English." Rodrigo wondered aloud, his mind racing with questions. "I have no idea what they're discussing. They always shut the door behind them when they go in." Julia just shrugged, offering no answers, and left the room, leaving Rodrigo more puzzled than before. The unease gnawed at him, the strange behavior of Cristina's parents refusing to leave his thoughts. Desperate for clarity, he resolved to ask Dr. Lorenzo for help, but each time he tried, the doctor was either tied up in surgery or had taken leave for vacation. The next morning, Rodrigo's impatience grew unbearable as he anxiously awaited his wife's arrival. When Cristina finally appeared, her demeanor was cold, and her visit was fleeting. She stayed only 5 minutes before turning to leave. "Why are you rushing off so quickly? We haven't seen each other in 3 days. Rodrigo protested, his voice laced with hurt. "Please stay a little longer. And I need to ask you something. Do your parents speak any English?" Cristina cut him off abruptly. "No, they don't. I'll come back tomorrow, and I promise I'll stay longer, but I have to go now." "I'm sorry, darling." The word darling sent a shiver down Rodrigo's spine. It was a term of endearment Raquel, his ex-wife, had often used, and hearing it now felt like a cruel echo from the past. Rodrigo's heart tightened with resentment, but before he could respond, Cristina's tone softened. "Rodrigo, soon everything will be fine," she assured him, her voice gentle. "Just lie down, rest, and regain your strength. I'll see you tomorrow." She left him with a lingering scent of her perfume, a fragrance that hung in the air long after she had gone. As Rodrigo lay there, the sunlight blazed through the window, merciless and harsh, casting sharp shadows across the room. Then, through the glare, he caught sight of Cristina's parents outside the hospital, trying to remain inconspicuous under the shade of the trees. They were engaged in an intense conversation with a distinguished-looking man. Rodrigo's curiosity piqued. Who was this man? Could he be a new interpreter? And what was it they were discussing so fervently? He strained to hear, and then, to his shock, He caught fragments of English words drifting up to his window. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Christina's parents could speak English. Why had they hidden this from him? What was the purpose of this deception? An uneasy feeling settled in his chest, and Rodrigo knew he had to uncover the truth. Something deep within him demanded answers, something that had been gnawing at him, preventing him from eating or sleeping in peace. His soul cried out for the truth, and Rodrigo resolved to follow his instincts. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. "Julia, I need your help," he sighed, desperation lacing his voice as he grasped her hand. "I need your clothes." "What?" Julia exclaimed, her eyes widening in shock. "Have you lost your mind?" No. Rodrigo quickly waved his hand, realizing how absurd his request sounded. "I need a uniform and a medical mask like yours. I don't have time to explain everything, but please, will you help me?" Julia looked at him for a moment, her brow furrowed in concern. But then she nodded silently. She led him to a back room where she quickly found a gown and pants in the right size and handed them to him. Rodrigo wasted no time. He changed into the medical attire with a sense of urgency and hurried off, while Julia stayed behind, waiting anxiously. Disguised as a hospital staff member, Rodrigo made his way to the trio, positioning himself close enough to hear their conversation without drawing attention to himself. "Can you guarantee a positive outcome?" Barbara, Christina's mother, asked the man in flawless English, her voice sharp and demanding. "Well, it all depends on the circumstances," the man replied cautiously. "It depends on him. If he doesn't want to, he won't sign anything." "But you were recommended to us as the best notary," Barbara retorted, her frustration palpable. "We're counting on you to ensure that when he dies, the inheritance goes to Christina." "I never promised to ensure anything," the notary responded coolly. "I simply made some recommendations and provided a will template." "We paid you a fortune for this," Barbara snapped, her temper flaring. "And I've kept my end of the bargain by remaining silent about your plans," the notary reminded them calmly. "As they say, silence is golden. Here are your documents. Contact me when the client is ready." Rodrigo's blood ran cold. Were they talking about him? Were they planning to rob him of everything? Scheming to transfer his inheritance to Christina? The very thought of it filled him with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "These people," he thought bitterly, "they're plotting to bury me before my time and steal every penny I've earned. This is sacrilege, pure and simple. How could they be so heartless?" His mind raced as new suspicions formed. Wait a minute, they speak English fluently, and they're not German. Could Christina be lying about her identity as well? Was she in on this from the start, luring me into her trap like a gullible fool? Rodrigo's fury grew with each thought. He had been deceived and manipulated into a web of lies by people he had come to trust. Shaking with anger, Rodrigo returned to his room, tearing off the gown and mask with trembling hands. He sank into the chair, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Moments later, Julia entered to collect the uniform, pausing as she noticed the turmoil etched on Rodrigo's face. She could see he was wrestling with something profound, something that had shaken him to his core. Sensing his need for solitude, she quietly gathered her things and left the room, leaving Rodrigo alone with his thoughts, his heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. His wife's cheerful voice jolted Rodrigo out of his spiraling thoughts. "Darling, are you okay?" Christina asked with a feigned sweetness, gesturing toward her parents, Barbara and Thomas, who stood beside her with forced smiles plastered on their faces. "What happened to your face? It looks worse," she added, her voice tinged with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Barbara and Thomas exchanged quick, meaningful glances, but this time, Rodrigo didn't miss it. A day earlier, he might have dismissed their looks as nothing, but now, after witnessing their deceitful scheme, everything appeared different, clearer, more sinister. "They're mocking me," he thought bitterly, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. "Well, let them have their fun. They'll get what's coming to them." "Yes, I feel terrible today," Rodrigo replied aloud, his voice carrying a tone of exhaustion. "I barely have the strength to get out of bed, let alone eat. It feels like I'm getting worse, and I can't shake the feeling that the end is near." Barbara and Thomas exchanged a few hurried words in low, hushed tones before Thomas turned to Rodrigo, his face carefully arranged into a mask of concern. "Don't say that, Dad," Christina interjected, her voice suddenly full of false cheerfulness as her eyes gleamed with an unnatural joy. "We need to stay positive. And there's something important we should take care of." How to put it? Well, we need to make sure that if anything happens, your estate goes to the person who matters most to you, she added, her voice dripping with sweetness as she sat beside him, gently stroking his head. "You wouldn't want everything to go to the state, would you?" Rodrigo looked at her, already knowing the answer but playing along. "Who should I leave my property and the money in my accounts to?" Christina's face brightened with satisfaction as she hugged him tightly. "Well, for example, to the person who loves you more than anything," she sang sweetly, her arms wrapped around him. "Of course, I could leave everything to you," Rodrigo said, slapping his forehead theatrically. "I'm so glad you brought this up. I'll do it, but I don't have a pen or paper on hand." "I have everything we need right here," Christina quickly replied, grabbing Thomas's briefcase. "I've been working on reports lately, so I still have some letter paper left. I always bring work home, you've seen it yourself. I haven't been able to visit you as often because of it, but I'll send you a sample by email tonight." "It doesn't matter, you're very considerate," Rodrigo responded with a forced smile, all the while cursing the day he ever walked into that bar where he first met her. Barbara, sensing the moment, handed him a pen and a stack of papers. "Tomorrow, I'll come back with a notary to legalize your signature," Christina added, her eyes sparkling with what could only be described as happiness. "I'm looking forward to seeing you recover. But for now, it's best if everyone believes I'm the one helping you, looking out for you." "Yes, you're very affectionate," Rodrigo said, his voice laced with a bitter edge that he barely concealed. When the satisfied trio finally left, Rodrigo immediately tore the paper into pieces and threw the pen into the trash. He couldn't stand the thought of touching anything that those traitors had handed him. Julia entered the room a few minutes later, immediately noticing the dark cloud hanging over him. "Why are you so down? How can people be so cruel? Tell me what's going on," she urged gently, her concern genuine. Rodrigo couldn't find any peace within himself. The betrayal weighed heavily on his heart. "Well, people can be very different," Julia offered, trying to comfort him. "My parents abandoned me when I was little. I grew up in an orphanage, so money doesn't mean much to me. I never thought of you as rich," she added with a light, cheerful tone. "You don't come across that way, Rodrigo managed a small smile, feeling a bit of the tension ease. Julia's straightforwardness and warmth were a welcome contrast to the duplicity he had been surrounded by. "I always thought rich people were arrogant and only ate fancy seafood, but you eat porridge and potatoes like everyone else." Julia's words finally broke through the layers of resentment that had built up inside him. He suddenly realized how hungry he was. Hadn't they announced breakfast yet? Together, they headed to the dining room, where the enticing aroma of curd casserole filled the air, reminding Rodrigo of simpler pleasures. As he ate, clarity began to return to his mind. He knew what he had to do. Later that morning, Don Emilio, Rodrigo's personal lawyer and trusted notary, arrived in his room. Don Emilio had always been more than just a legal advisor. He was like a grandfather to Rodrigo, treating him with a mix of professional respect and paternal care. "You called for me, Rodrigo? What's the matter?" Don Emilio asked, his voice full of concern as he noticed the tension in Rodrigo's demeanor. "Yes, I need to make a will," Rodrigo replied, his tone calm but firm. Don Emilio's expression turned serious as he clutched his chest in surprise. "Is it that serious? Is there no hope, my son? How did this happen?" Rodrigo shook his head, frowning at the thought. No, I'm not dying, although my wife would probably love that," he said with a bitter chuckle. "But let's draft a provisional will. We can always rewrite it later if things change." Of course, Don Emilio agreed, pulling out his notepad. Tell me your wishes, and I'll draft it accordingly. So, with a heavy heart, Rodrigo dictated the terms of his first will. It was a difficult task. After all, it's not often that someone so young has to think so deeply about death and the legacy they will leave behind. Once it was finished, Rodrigo handed the document to Don Emilio. Take it and keep it safe, Rodrigo instructed. And I have another request. From now on, I want 1% of my company's income to go directly to the city's orphanage. Please prepare the necessary order and make sure the financiers handle it. Don Emilio nodded, clearly moved by Rodrigo's decision. I'll take care of everything, my son. You've made a wise and generous choice. He left, the weight of Rodrigo's words lingering in the air. As Rodrigo watched him go, he felt a sense of relief. The plan was in motion, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of control over his fate. But deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over yet. The real challenge was still to come. He would need to remain vigilant, to see through the deceit that had infiltrated his life, and to protect what was rightfully his from those who sought to take it away. It will be done, Don Emilio assured him, his voice filled with quiet resolve. I've always wanted to engage in charitable work, and this is a worthy cause. As the notary left, Rodrigo found himself alone with his thoughts, reflecting deeply on the twists and turns his life had taken. How had he allowed people like Raquel and Christina to weave their way into his world? If such toxic individuals have managed to cling to you, then perhaps there is something within yourself that needs to change, Rodrigo mused. His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. As it swung open, Christina entered. Her face lit up with an artificial glow of hope, followed closely by Barbara and Thomas. The same notary Rodrigo had seen outside earlier trailed behind them, his expression neutral but observant. How are you feeling, darling? Christina began with a feigned sweetness, her voice dripping with insincerity. Have you made the will? Yes, Rodrigo responded, his tone calm and steady, masking the turmoil inside. And has the notary legalized it? Christina asked her question laced with sarcasm as her eyes narrowed slightly. Rodrigo nodded. He did. Why do you ask? We've brought our notary, Christina said, gesturing toward the man who stood quietly beside them. And, if it's not too much to ask, what exactly is in that will? Is it a secret? Of course, it's not a secret, Rodrigo replied, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. I've decided to leave everything I have to the city's orphanage after I pass away. A fiduciary will be appointed to manage the funds, and I'll also distribute a portion among my employees to encourage them to continue improving and growing the company. Thanks to your suggestion, I feel much lighter now, knowing I've made the right decision. Christina's face turned a shade darker, her nostrils flaring with barely contained rage. I haven't forgotten you, Christina, Rodrigo continued, his tone now tinged with sarcasm. I left you something very special, some aquarium fish. I know how much you admire them, and I'm sure you'll earn your own money. You're quite the businesswoman after all, and supporting orphans won't hurt you. When they leave the orphanage, they'll have financial support to help them start anew. Since you've often reminded me that you're an independent and wealthy woman, I didn't want to offend you with a more substantial gift. Christina's composure shattered. How could you? She screamed, her voice shrill with disbelief. Do I mean nothing to you? Are these pathetic beggars more important than I am? Rodrigo met her outburst with a cold stare. Christina, I've realized I've wasted my time with you, he said, his voice firm and unwavering. Suddenly, Barbara's voice cut through the tension, her perfect English a stark contrast to the lie they had maintained. I can't believe this, she shouted, her frustration boiling over. Thomas waved his hands in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. How can you throw away your fortune like that? Thomas interjected, his voice pleading. You should rewrite the will and leave everything to Christina. She's your wife. She'll know how to use it wisely, unlike those funds, which will just be squandered. Rodrigo's eyes flashed with anger. Who's going to squander it? Thieves like you, he retorted sharply. By the way, congratulations on your language skills. So, you're not the foreigners you pretended to be. You've mastered English quite well. Surprised? Yes, I know everything now, so it would be best for you to leave before you find yourselves in jail. Barbara, her face contorted with fury, spat out her words. You have nothing on us? She hissed, turning sharply on her heel. Rodrigo didn't miss a beat. Ah, how eloquent you've become, Barbara. If that's even your real name, he replied, his voice icy. And if my lawyers dig a little deeper and uncover that you're not Barbara, and that Christina isn't your daughter, I wonder how much time you'll spend behind bars for fraud. His words struck the trio like a blow, leaving them momentarily speechless. Barbara stormed out of the room, her heels clicking furiously against the floor, followed closely by Thomas and Christina, who shot Rodrigo a look filled with pure hatred before disappearing through the door. As the door closed behind them, Rodrigo felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. The weight that had been pressing down on his soul lifted, leaving him feeling lighter and freer. He was grateful that he hadn't been deceived by the imposters, that he had seen through their web of lies in time. And as for Christina, he realized with startling clarity that he hadn't truly loved her as much as he had convinced himself. Their relationship had been built on illusions, and now that the truth was laid bare, he could see just how hollow it all had been. Fortunately, Christina never returned to the hospital, and Rodrigo was left to rebuild his life, free from the clutches of those who had sought to manipulate and betray him. 2 days later, Don Emilio returned with a stack of papers for Rodrigo to sign. To Rodrigo's surprise, Christina had filed for divorce. After explaining the situation, the lawyer informed him that Christina had simply realized there was nothing more to gain from him and had decided to cut her losses and run. She'll find another dad soon enough, Rodrigo remarked dryly, his voice carrying the weight of his disillusionment. Then, his tone grew serious as he addressed Don Emilio. I need to ask you a big favor. I want you to dig up everything you can on Christina and her so-called parents. I don't think they're going to leave me alone that easily, and we need to be ready for whatever they might try next. Don Emilio nodded, understanding the gravity of the request. Rodrigo had always prided himself on his strategic thinking, and now, more than ever, he knew that being one step ahead was crucial. The following morning, Dr. Lorenzo arrived with somber news. The latest tests confirmed what Rodrigo had feared. He urgently needed surgery. It's going to be difficult, Lorenzo admitted, his expression serious. But I have the experience and the skill to carry it out successfully. I can't promise it will be easy, but I strongly advise you to go through with it. Rodrigo met the doctor's gaze with determination. I'm ready, he declared. Do whatever you need to do, but get me back on my feet. I'm tired of feeling like an old man at 29. Lorenzo nodded, respecting Rodrigo's resolve, and left to make the necessary arrangements. When Julia heard about Rodrigo's impending surgery, she was filled with concern but also with a fierce determination to support him. She surrounded him with care, making sure he knew he wasn't facing this challenge alone. I believe everything will turn out well, she said, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. And about the divorce, I'm glad those scoundrels are out of your life. Something always felt off about them, so you haven't lost anything. The most important thing now is your health. Rodrigo looked at Julia with newfound appreciation. He realized how kind, selfless, and beautiful she was in her way. There was nothing in her that he disliked. No greed, no anger, no betrayal. For the first time, he understood that he had fallen in love with her, and this realization gave him the strength he needed to face the operation. The next day, the surgery took place. It was grueling, lasting over 17 hours, but the doctors were relentless, performing what many would later call a miracle. Julia was there the entire time, waiting anxiously outside the operating room. When Rodrigo was finally transferred to the intensive care unit, she was at his side, and she remained there when he was moved to a regular ward. Julia had been in love with Rodrigo for a long time, silently and without expecting anything in return. The stress of worrying about him had taken its toll. She had lost weight, couldn't sleep, and her thoughts were consumed with his well-being. But now, seeing him recover, her love seemed to have helped conquer his illness. Rodrigo's recovery was swift, faster than anyone had anticipated. The entire hospital was abuzz with the news of his miraculous turnaround. Word of his ordeal and recovery soon spread beyond the hospital, circulating through the city like wildfire. When Rodrigo was finally well enough to receive visitors, Don Emilio came to his room with startling news. "You won't believe what I've discovered," Don Emilio said, his voice trembling with excitement. He handed Rodrigo a file filled with documents. Christina isn't Christina at all. Her real name is Carolina. She was an orphan, and at 10 years old, she was adopted by a couple named Sarah and Howard Connors, the same people you knew as Barbara and Thomas. Rodrigo's eyes widened as he processed the information. Don Emilio continued, "They trained her in deception from a young age. At first, they had her begging at train stations. Later, she pretended to be a gypsy, telling fortunes. Eventually, they became a team of professional con artists, skilled in theft and financial scams. They've amassed a considerable fortune over the years and have always managed to stay ahead of the law. You're incredibly fortunate you didn't sign over your assets to her. As it stands, you owe her nothing, because the majority of your wealth was acquired before the marriage." Rodrigo let out a slow breath, a mixture of relief and anger surging through him. He had come so close to losing everything to those imposters, but now, thanks to Don Emilio's diligence and his instincts, he had escaped their trap. He looked at the lawyer with gratitude. "Thank you, Don Emilio. You've done more for me than I can ever repay." Don Emilio smiled, a paternal warmth in his eyes. "There's no need for thanks, my boy. I'm just glad you're safe. Now focus on your recovery. The rest will fall into place." As Don Emilio left, Rodrigo felt a profound sense of closure. The shadows that had haunted him were beginning to lift, and in their place, he saw the possibility of a future filled with honesty, love, and the kind of strength he had rediscovered within himself. And with Julia by his side, he knew he wouldn't have to face that future alone. Rodrigo exhaled deeply, the weight of recent events pressing on his mind. "Wow," he murmured, more to himself than to Don Emilio. "I had a feeling something was off, and it looks like this incident turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I suppose you could say I'm very lucky." Don Emilio nodded but added a note of caution. "We still have to go through the court proceedings," he warned. "Carolina, Christina, as we've known her, will likely demand a portion of your assets during the divorce. But don't worry, I'll be right by your side throughout the process." A few days later, Rodrigo was discharged from the hospital. He said his goodbyes to Julia, with whom he had formed a close bond, but they promised to stay in touch. First, though, he had to finalize the divorce that would sever his ties with the deceitful trio. When the day came for the court hearing, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. Those present were astounded by the audacity of the once humble and demure Carolina, who now stood confidently before the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying an air of entitlement, "I demand that my husband give me half of all his assets." The judge turned to Rodrigo. "Are you willing to share your income with your wife after the divorce?" Rodrigo looked straight at Carolina, his gaze unwavering. "Let her tell me her real name first." "She's a liar," he stated firmly. Realizing that her deceit had been exposed far more quickly than she anticipated, Carolina paused, calculating the legal risks she was now facing. Finally, she spoke with a calmness that belied the storm brewing within her. "Your Honor, I withdraw my demand. I've changed my mind." And just like that, the trio of thieves found themselves defenseless for the first time, their carefully constructed lies crumbling around them. Rodrigo wasted no time. As soon as the proceedings were over, he hurried to Julia's house, having found her address through the hospital records. Julia's home was located in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. As Rodrigo approached the small, worn-down house, he was struck by the simplicity of the place. It was hard to imagine someone like Julia, who had shown him so much kindness, living in such humble conditions. He knocked on the door, and when Julia opened it and saw him standing there with a beautiful bouquet, she was momentarily speechless. "Hello?" Rodrigo greeted her with a warm smile. "It's me. I'm sorry for showing up unannounced, especially since we didn't even exchange phone numbers. I wasn't expecting to see you," Julia admitted, still a bit flustered. "Come in, I'll make us some tea. And thank you for the flowers, they're beautiful. No one has ever given me flowers like these before. I don't even have a vase. I'll have to put them in a regular jar. I just baked a cake." You arrived at the perfect time. While Julia busied herself in the small, cozy kitchen, Rodrigo took the opportunity to look around the house. It was small, with only 2 rooms, one of which was tiny. As he walked into the smaller room, he noticed a cot where a child of about 4 years old was sleeping peacefully. Julia entered the room quietly behind him. "This is my son and my heartache," she said softly. Rodrigo turned to her, surprised. "You never told me you had a son," he said, his voice gentle. "He looks so much like you. It's uncanny." Julia sighed, a shadow passing over her face. "Yes, I was married once, but my husband left me for another woman when Jorge was just a baby, only 1 year old. We divorced, and I've raised Jorge on my own since then. He has congenital developmental delays. He's very intelligent, understands everything, and even knows how to write, but he can't speak. I've taken him to doctors, but they all say there's nothing they can do. He needs expensive tests, and I just don't have the money for that." Rodrigo felt a surge of compassion and determination. "I'll pay for it," he said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes, I'll cover the costs." Julia shook her head, her eyes filling with emotion. "Please don't feel obligated. I'm not telling you this because I want something from you. I like you, that's all," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "And I like you too," Rodrigo replied with a sincere smile. "It's no trouble at all. Let's wait for Jorge to wake up, and then we'll head to my place. No more arguing about it." Julia, despite her nerves, laughed softly, touched by his kindness. The medical examination revealed that Jorge's condition wasn't as severe as initially thought. With the right medication and the help of a qualified specialist, there was hope that his condition could improve significantly. It was just a matter of finding the right doctor, and Rodrigo, driven by a newfound purpose, was determined to make it happen. Before long, they found a young doctor named Asuncion, who came highly recommended. She began working with Jorge at Rodrigo's house, and from the very first day, she managed to charm the little boy. Jorge quickly became attached to her, following her around like a puppy. Asuncion's daily sessions with Jorge seemed to be helping, but as time went on, it became clear that her interest in the child was waning. Instead, she began to set her sights on Rodrigo, captivated by the wealth and influence he possessed. Asuncion, who was very attractive and well aware of it, decided to make her move. One day, while they were on the terrace where Rodrigo liked to spend his time, she saw her chance. "What wonderful weather we're having today," she said, trying to strike up a conversation. "Yes, it's perfect," Rodrigo replied, nodding. "How's Jorge doing?" "Everything is fine," Asuncion answered briefly, before shifting her tone to one of flirtation. "Can you help me unbutton my blouse? The clasp got caught at the back, and I can't reach it." Rodrigo, ever the gentleman, stood up to help her. He respected Asuncion as a doctor and wanted to keep things professional for Jorge's sake. "There you go, it's all done," he said, stepping back. "Thank you," Asuncion cooed, her voice dripping with charm. "What would I do without you?" She then pretended to stumble as she moved, and Rodrigo instinctively caught her in his arms. Taking advantage of the situation, Asuncion wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her body against his. At that moment, Julia walked onto the terrace and saw the scene unfold before her. She froze, her heart clenching with a mixture of resentment and jealousy. If she had witnessed the entire conversation from the beginning, she might have exploded with anger. But now, all she could do was swallow her feelings and pretend nothing had happened. "My son has rested. You can continue your session," Julia said curtly, giving Asuncion a cold, furious look. This was exactly the reaction Asuncion had been hoping for. Her calculated move had struck its target. Rodrigo, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its cause, felt a wave of confusion wash over him. He knew he needed to address what had just happened, but the timing wasn't right. For now, he would have to navigate the delicate situation with care, knowing that the relationships around him were becoming increasingly complicated. In the days that followed, Asuncion became more determined in her efforts to hurt Julia, subtly and maliciously undermining her whenever possible. Julia's tender soul bore the brunt of these attacks, though Rodrigo, preoccupied with work and unaware of the cunning doctor's true intentions, remained oblivious to the emotional warfare being waged in his own home. After returning from a particularly long business trip, Rodrigo was shocked to find the house empty. Neither Julia nor Jorge was there to greet him, and the silence in the home felt oppressive. On the table, he found a single note in Julia's handwriting. "Don't look for us. You chose Asuncion, so I won't stand in the way of your happiness." Rodrigo crumpled the note in his hand, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and confusion. "What nonsense is this?" he exclaimed, his voice echoing through the empty house. He had never expected that the problems in his life would come from such an unexpected direction. The next day, when Asuncion rang the doorbell, Rodrigo opened it with a resolute expression. He handed her an envelope filled with money, saying curtly, "Thank you, but we no longer need your services. And let me give you some advice. Do not dishonor the honorable name of a doctor with your actions." Before Asuncion could even muster a response, Rodrigo slammed the door in her face, ending whatever influence she thought she had over him. Desperate to find Julia and Jorge, Rodrigo rushed to her house, only to find it locked and empty. He then headed to the hospital, where he questioned her colleagues about her whereabouts. "She might have gone to the countryside," suggested one of the nurses. "I remember she once took me to visit her grandfather's house in the village. After he passed away, she inherited the house. You should look for her there. She doesn't have anywhere else to go." Rodrigo wasted no time and drove directly to the village. It wasn't far, but the journey felt like an eternity as his mind raced with worry and hope. Upon arrival, the village administration confirmed that Julia Rogers had indeed moved there with her son and had recently accepted a job as a paramedic, much to the delight of the locals, who were in dire need of medical staff. As he neared her grandfather's house, nestled by the forest and surrounded by a quaint garden, night had already fallen. The moonlight bathed the garden in a soft glow, and Rodrigo saw Julia working quietly, tending to the plants with Jorge playing nearby. His heart swelled with a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation as he reached into his pocket, feeling the small box that held the ring he had brought with him, a token of his commitment and love. In his other hand, he clutched a bouquet. "Dad!" Jorge's voice suddenly rang out, clear and joyful. "Dad!" Julia, startled by the sound, dropped the basket she was carrying. The sight of Rodrigo standing there, illuminated by the moonlight and holding their son, filled her with a rush of emotions too powerful to contain. Jorge ran toward Rodrigo with open arms, and Rodrigo scooped him up, burying his face in the boy's curly hair, overwhelmed with love. "You smell like apples, son," Rodrigo whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Julia stood frozen for a moment, tears streaming down her face. Her son had finally spoken, his first word, and the man she loved had come back to her, acknowledging Jorge as his own. She rushed over to them, her heart overflowing with joy. "Jorge, look, Dad is here," she said, her voice trembling with happiness as she embraced them both. The scene did not go unnoticed by the villagers, who gathered quietly to witness the tender reunion. It had been a long time since they had seen such raw emotion, and they watched captivated. "Will you marry me?" Rodrigo asked, his voice raw with sincerity and urgency. "Yes," Julia whispered, her answer immediate and heartfelt. "Promise me you won't trust anyone but me," Rodrigo said firmly, looking into her eyes. "There are so many people in this world who envy the happiness of others. Don't let them come between us again. Now, let's go home. People are watching us like we're in an Indian movie." Julia laughed, a sound filled with relief and joy. "Let them watch," she said, her smile broadening as she felt the warmth of his love surrounding her. That night, over dinner, they shared their thoughts and fears, relieved that everything had turned out well in the end. "You were wise to come looking for me," Julia said with a smile. "I was foolish enough to let the first woman I met destroy my fragile happiness. Can you imagine? Not long ago, a local farmer proposed to me, but I rejected him because I couldn't stop loving you. He was such a drunkard that I had to kick him out." Rodrigo chuckled, his heart light for the first time in weeks. "Let him try anything," he said, turning to Jorge with a playful smile. "Jorge and I will take care of him, right, son?" Jorge, now fully awake and happy to be with his family, grinned and said, "Yes, and I have a wooden sword to protect my mother." Rodrigo and Julia laughed, their hearts filled with love and hope for the future. The trials they had faced had only strengthened their bond, and now, with Jorge by their side, they were ready to build the life they had always dreamed of, together. Everyone laughed heartily as they continued to savor Julia's delicious raspberry cakes. It was clear she had a real talent for cooking, and the simple joy of being surrounded by nature and the warmth of the villagers sparked an idea in Rodrigo. "I could stay here forever," Rodrigo admitted, a contented smile on his face. "What if you and I became farmers? We could buy that farm from the alcoholic and make a life here. The villagers need quality products, and I already have connections in the market. It wouldn't be difficult to make it work. What do you think?" Julia's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really?" she exclaimed, almost unable to believe what she was hearing. "I love being here. The peace, the fresh air. It's exactly what I want for us and Jorge. Just look at his rosy cheeks. He's thriving here." "Then it's settled," Rodrigo said, his decision made. "I'll go back to the city to sell the business, and you stay here with the good news. Everything will work out fine." The local farmer was more than willing to sell his property, albeit for a hefty sum, but for Rodrigo, it was a fair price to secure a new life for his family. They signed the contract, and now all that remained was to sell his business profitably to someone who would appreciate it and take care of his employees. Rodrigo was willing to do whatever it took to ensure the transition was smooth and that his team would remain secure in their jobs. A few days later, as Rodrigo sat in his office reviewing company documents, the door burst open, and Don Emilio, his ever-loyal lawyer, stormed in, clearly agitated. "Have you seen who's come forward as a potential buyer for your company?" Don Emilio demanded, his face flushed with anger. "No, not yet," Rodrigo replied, surprised by his lawyer's sudden outburst. "I didn't expect anyone to move so quickly. Who is it?" "It's Carolina and her bizarre clan of relatives," Don Emilio exclaimed, nearly shaking with disbelief. "I almost fell out of my chair when I saw their offer. Don't you dare sell it to them, Rodrigo. I'll curse you if you do. Have you lost your mind?" "Of course not," Rodrigo reassured him, but he couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. "I have no intention of selling to her, but I'm curious. Where on earth did she get that kind of money? This feels like another one of her schemes." "Exactly," Don Emilio said, his expression serious. "You can't trust them. They must have something up their sleeves." Rodrigo nodded, deep in thought. "Get our head of security on the phone," he instructed. "I want him to investigate this thoroughly. I need to know where the money is coming from and what she's planning." Don Emilio left the office to make the necessary calls, while Rodrigo sat back, his mind racing. The thought of Carolina, who had already tried to deceive him once, being involved in another twisted plot made him uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger and far more dangerous. But who was the shadowy figure pulling the strings this time? Who had allied themselves with the cunning woman who had nearly ruined his life before? Rodrigo knew he had to stay vigilant, for the stakes were higher than ever. By the end of the day, the head of security made his way to Rodrigo's office, a look of satisfaction on his face that immediately caught Rodrigo's attention. He knew there was news. "Your ex-wife, Carolina, was married and widowed," the head of security said without preamble. Her husband was a mountaineer. They say he fell off a cliff. Eyewitnesses confirmed his death. So now Carolina is a rich widow with untold wealth. Starting to look like that might have been part of her plan all along. And maybe, just maybe, she was responsible for his death. Rodrigo added, his voice tinged with suspicion. It seems she's decided to launder the money by buying our company. Given its business volume and prospects, this could be her way of securing a legitimate front for her ill-gotten gains. We might need to involve the police, but in the meantime, we should find out her current address. Rodrigo suggested, the weight of the situation sinking in. The head of security nodded. Agreed. But you should know, unless there's a body, there's no case, he said with a shrug. If we started throwing everyone in jail based on suspicion alone, we'd run out of space pretty quickly. But thanks for your vigilance. Now let us handle this. We've got real criminals to catch. Rodrigo realized that arguing with a weary cop without concrete evidence would get him nowhere. He needed to check things out for himself. Armed with Carolina's address, he decided to take matters into his own hands. That evening, he parked his car near the house where Carolina was living with her parents, waiting patiently for hours. As night fell, he saw Carolina cautiously drive out of the mansion's garage. After a few moments, Rodrigo followed her, keeping a safe distance to avoid detection. They drove to the outskirts of the city, where Carolina pulled up to a dilapidated hut standing alone on a vacant lot. Rodrigo watched as she got out of the car and looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone was following her. He had hidden his car among some bushes, using the cover of darkness to stay out of sight. His heart pounded in his chest as he pulled out a flashlight from his pocket and activated the recording function on his phone. Quietly, he followed Carolina into the rundown building. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Rodrigo heard Carolina's voice, harsh and unkind. "So you're not dead yet, idiot?" she spat, her words filled with venom. In the dim light, he could barely make out a figure mumbling something in response. Rodrigo switched on his powerful flashlight, revealing the shocking scene before him. A frail-looking man was sitting on the floor, bound hand and foot, with a gag in his mouth. Carolina stood over him, a baseball bat gripped tightly in her hands, poised to strike. Beside her was a gasoline canister, a clear indication of her deadly intent. She was planning to kill the man and set the place on fire to cover up the crime. Without hesitation, Rodrigo stepped out of the shadows, flashlight shining directly at Carolina. "It's the police!" he shouted with authority. "Drop the bat and step away from the victim. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Carolina froze, her eyes wide with shock and fear as the bat slipped from her fingers and clattered to the ground. She was caught, and there was no escaping the consequences this time. The man on the floor stared at Rodrigo with a mixture of hope and disbelief, while Carolina's face drained of color, realizing that her carefully laid plans had unraveled in an instant. Rodrigo kept his flashlight trained on her, his heart still pounding but now with a sense of triumph. He had finally uncovered the truth, and justice would be served. Carolina stood up, her face a mask of shock. "You?" she gasped, utterly surprised to see Rodrigo standing before her. "Yes, it's me," Rodrigo replied firmly, pulling out his phone and aiming it at her. "And everything you say now is being recorded on video. This video will go straight to the network, so you better think twice before you say anything. So, you've decided to kill this man. Who are you really, Carolina?" In a sudden burst of desperation, Carolina lunged at Rodrigo with a savage growl, but Rodrigo was prepared. With a quick and practiced movement, he immobilized her, securing her with the rope she had intended for her victim. Once she was restrained, Rodrigo turned his attention to the man on the floor, quickly freeing him from his bonds. "Are you this monster's husband? Hold on, you'll be fine," Rodrigo reassured him, helping the frail man to his feet. The man, who appeared to be around 60 years old but looked even older due to malnutrition and the inhumane conditions he had endured, nodded weakly and began to cry, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. The police, alerted by Rodrigo earlier, arrived promptly at the scene. They took Carolina into custody, along with her accomplices who were later arrested at various locations. In the subsequent trial, each member of the criminal group was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and Carolina's marriage to her former husband was officially annulled. After the trial, Don Antonio, the millionaire who had been Carolina's husband and victim, approached Rodrigo, his eyes filled with gratitude and newfound resolve. "Can I visit you from time to time?" Don Antonio asked, his voice soft but earnest. "I'd like to be a father to you if you'll let me." Rodrigo, touched by the offer, smiled warmly. "Thank you for calling me son. It's been a long time since I've heard those words, and I won't reject a real father. You know what? Let's go to the village. I have a fiancé there, Julia and Jorge, my soon-to-be stepson. The wedding is in a week. You can relax in the countryside and regain your strength. I'd love to invite you." Don Antonio's face lit up with happiness, grateful for the invitation. A week later, Rodrigo and Julia's wedding took place, and it was a magnificent celebration. The entire village gathered to witness the union, offering their congratulations and gifts to the newlyweds. As the celebration reached its peak, Don Antonio stood up to speak. "Julia, Rodrigo, I'm incredibly happy to be part of your family. You've accepted me as a father, and I want to give you something special as a token of my gratitude and love. I present to you the farm you've always dreamed of. Become its owners and use it to bring good to the people." The newlyweds were stunned by the generosity of Don Antonio's gift, their hearts swelling with gratitude. The crowd erupted into applause, everyone raising their glasses in a toast to the couple's new life filled with promise and happiness. Rodrigo's heart swelled with overwhelming joy as Julia's words sank in. "What? I'm going to be a father?" he repeated, still in shock, his voice filled with awe. "Wow!" he exclaimed, his face lighting up with a radiant smile. Just then, Jorge, who had been playing nearby, overheard the news. His eyes widened with excitement as he processed what was being said. "I'm going to be a big brother?" he asked, his voice filled with pure delight. Rodrigo knelt at Jorge's level, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Yes, buddy, you're going to be a big brother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jorge's happiness was palpable as he jumped up and down, clapping his hands. "This is the best day ever," he shouted, his joy infectious, spreading to everyone around. Julia joined in the embrace, her heart full as she watched the two most important people in her life share this special moment. The guests, moved by the touching scene, erupted into cheers and applause, sharing in the family's happiness. As the celebration continued, the village became alive with even more laughter, love, and anticipation for the future. The news of Julia's pregnancy added an extra layer of joy to the day, turning an already perfect wedding into an unforgettable event. The night was filled with toasts and well wishes, everyone celebrating the bright future awaiting Rodrigo, Julia, Jorge, and their growing family. For Rodrigo, the day was nothing short of a miracle. He had found true love, and now he was about to embark on the most incredible journey of all fatherhood. As he looked around at the smiling faces of his friends, family, and neighbors, he knew that their future, built on love and trust, was going to be filled with endless happiness and cherished memories. As we wrap up, take a moment to reflect on everything we've discussed. What stood out to you? What's one thing you've learned today that you'll apply in your own life? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you found this video helpful, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support means the world to us.